Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to refresh yourself a little bit, at least with a cup of coffee. The break is not long, but then again, the event is not the whole day, so we should be fine. We're continuing with the second session, where it's my great pleasure to continue to debate the issues of consumer policy. And we're going to start basically the day with a very hands-on approach. So we're welcoming Ernest Barcelo from OMIA, who's going to be explaining how it is in a company to deal with the notions and the issues and the challenges and the changes of sustainability. So Ernest, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Lela, and thank you to the organization for the invitation. I hope that I will be able to share. Let me know if the screen is showing my presentation.
It's perfect. Just put it in full screen and we're all set.
Perfect. Now, okay. Yeah, so yes, this was the main purpose. While attending of your last year conference, I was learning a lot and I was enjoying a lot. And then my point was, okay, if there is a possibility, we need also to contribute. So here we are. I'm coming from the generation of, I'm an industrial engineer. On the university, when we were doing our things, there were some professors that were really angry because now we needed to put money on our calculations. They were saying before science was science, no? And then you were doing something on scientific domain, and that's it. There was a good idea, it will become a product. Then we were having a strong filter in my generation through the money. So you must have a good idea, but this idea must have a reasonable price and the cost must be under control. And then there was this first filter of the wild spirit of developing something from scientific approach. Nowadays, we are in a completely different scenario that is money for sure, but regulatory affairs is the key thing. And for most of us that we are not lawyers, this is not an easy domain. Then before starting from our company, one of the key topics is safety. And one of the things that I want to share with you is that home is much more dangerous than even a mine or a quarry. The statistics in most of the countries are showing that there are much more accidents, domestic accidents, that were related. So now that we are all connecting from home or from different places, please keep in mind that this is still a very dangerous environment and that the rules that you were having while physically in your office or in your place to work now should be applied in a slightly different way, but still apply because accidents are following us wherever we are, also at home. Then related to our discussion, do we have enough pieces of law or regulations or whatever? Yeah, and then what we are doing on the companies is to translate this into internal processes or procedures or whatever, but we all know that when the accident arises, that is always on Friday evening or during Sunday or whatever, there is not enough supervisory power around or the procedure that needs to be applied is under revision. The law that regulates the whole thing is under revision or whatever. And then what we are having only as an anchor with the reality are our values. In our company, modesty, courtesy, integrity, and perseverance are our value. But even in companies where company values are not so fully implemented, we have our personal ones. And this is also a link with our presentation. The idea here is to share some more questions than conclusions, like always. From these two different point of views that I'm trying to summarize here. I'm still a student in Finland, in Aalto, and I'm the Vice President of Sustainability in a multinational in Switzerland. And through these two experiences, I'm trying to condense here a few points to be discussed among all of us. First thing is, when I started with mathematics, and the beginning was Pythagoras and all this, no? And it was also the cradle of the democracy. And they were starting to do the way that we are now governing our countries and so on. But if you compare Pythagoras in Greece with the last Nobel laureates and the level that science has reached and the evolution of the implementation of democracy from the Greek times, the classic times, and now USA or any other advanced country, we see that maybe there is an imbalanced evolution on the way that science has developed and the way that we are implementing democracy to regulate all those things. That means that when we say from science to business through regulatory affairs, the level that we are applying to science and the level that is applied to develop the regulation maybe needs to be synchronized or to apply in a slightly different way. I was, some years ago, nominated as a group regulatory affairs, or first regulatory affairs for region Europe and so on. My main question was to answer this on a dinner with friends. What are you working? What is regulatory affairs? And we were having no clue, because theoretically in our company we have a legal department, and then we have a department that is regulatory affairs. And then when I was asking, hey, what are you doing on the legal department? They say, legislation and contracts and all this and so on. And then what is regulatory affairs? Well, regulatory affairs is all the rest. Yeah, but what does it mean exactly, all the rest? And then in Europe at that time, we were discussing about REACH and very complex pieces of legislation to regulate the way that we were placing our products into the market. We are a mining company, and we are also having a portfolio of distribution of fine chemicals. So how we check if we can sell something or not, or what are the rules? Do we need to have a safety data sheet, or do we need to apply for a REACH registration? So there were very complex discussions every time that we were going to a simple discussion about the evolution of our portfolio. And the main point was to try to simplify. Nowadays, what we are applying is the PAC rule. So regulatory affairs for us is to answer the question, is this product suitable for this application in this country? Then same product in different applications will have a completely different legal scenario. To be approved in one country does not mean that you will be approved on the neighboring one. Even in the case of US with California and so on, or in Europe, even to have something approved in US, it's not an immediate guarantee that you will have the green light to place this into California, or in Europe from one country to the other, there's still a lot of different things to be checked. So that's why when we are discussing today about the consumer's protection and so on, how to implement this from a company point of view, sometimes it's not that easy. So our answer to the question is first to go back to the basics and try to establish a very basic way of checking what are the requirements to place a product on the market with this PAC, product application contract. Because when we were starting the discussion, should we need to apply for a REACH registration, or this is a food contact material, you get lost immediately in a different pieces of legislation, and it's quite tricky to identify the right path and so on. But starting from the product, looking what is around this product and what are the traditional applications and in which countries we want to sell, this has helped us a lot. Then, what does it mean, law for engineers? I'm a registered engineer. I'm also a PhD candidate for doctor engineering. I've never ever learned anything about legislation. You see, on the official program, we were having a lot about engineering, science, mathematics, even economics, but legislation, you don't need legislation, or theoretically it's not needed. Then I'm also a ESE graduated and so on. Yeah, what does it mean, legislation? And if we learn in the business school something about legislation, it's mostly to regulate the contracts and so on. But this approach about regulatory affairs, this is a gray zone in the middle of nowhere and so on. But then we come to the reality and we have this breach of the Proposition 65 that is touching everything and so on. And then we suddenly, working on a multinational, we understand, be careful, because in UK there will be common law. It's not the same like Roman law. And then when we are implementing things in Saudi Arabia, be careful because it's a different system of law. We were having no idea as students. So this is something that we need to implement in a slightly different way. And again, coming back to the values, Canada is one of my favorite examples for the engineers. If you ever have met any Canadian engineer, you will see that they are wearing this ring on the hand that they are signing the projects. Because the idea was, hey, this is to remember you that when you are approving a calculation or a project or whatever, years ago there was a collapse of a big structure and so on, and this is the responsibility of the engineer. So what they are trying to inoculate into the students and to the graduate engineers is the personal responsibility. In some other countries, we are not that far. And then the call to our personal values is maybe not that strong. And without a call to personal values, that it looks like, for instance, in Spain, this is mostly for the physicians. No, you have the deontologic code and so on, and this is super strong. Other professions, maybe we are not that strong on promoting those things. And that's why we're discussing a lot about ethics and so on. But Canada for engineers is a good example. When you receive your ring, then you must be thinking about this every time that you are signing. So yeah, a good example. As a Catalan engineer, I'm having a sort of credit card, and on the microchip is my electronic signature, and then I can validate whatever without thinking that much or looking on my hand or whatever. So that's why the anchor to the personal values, company values, or society values, and so on, this is one of the ways that we can use to overcome the lack of transparency on the things that we need to implement to do all those topics. Then, again, who gives the green light? We were having a new product developed for the food contact, to go to food contact packaging and so on. And this is developed in a lab in Switzerland, and then you try to place this into the market. Where to start? You go to Europe, and then you will need to submit all the things on the EFSA and so on, or through the ECHA, but it is food contact, yeah, most probably will be the European Food Safety Agency and so on. It will be a very long and sometimes not fully transparent for the ones that we are placing their request process. Then you go to the FDA. A food contact notification is an expensive experiment, but you know the rules. There will be a letter coming immediately after the application. There will be a period of time that is fixed to have the first answer, and then there will be a total duration of the whole process is fully under control. And yeah, although it's expensive, you know when you start and when you will be finished with an okay or a not okay and so on. So that's why who is giving the green light today for a new development done wherever in the world, to be placed wherever in the world? Easiest path for food contact materials nowadays is food contact notification FDA, not European, not Asia, because Asia doesn't exist as a region, so you need to go to China and to ask for the same, or to go to every single country and ask for the same. If you have now a food contact notification from the FDA, the green light from Europe will be very fast. The green light in South America will be almost automatic. In most of the Asian countries, there will be an automatic translation from your food contact notification to the national legislation. So who is giving the green light? So trying to have a super complex regulatory frame, in this case, the FDA is having the green light on this transfer from science to business to regulatory affairs for this particular application. So we need to also think that while implementing different pieces of legislation and giving the control to different agencies, we are also creating, or not, a competitive advantage. In this case, food contact materials for food packaging, food contact notification of the FDA is the fastest path. Maybe not the cheapest, but nowadays on business, the speed will be translated immediately into money. And then who places the product on the market? Because if I do on my behalf the food contact notification, or if I use a law firm, or if one of our distributors does this and so on, they can have finally the path open to put other products on the same flow or not. Or if we need to do this food contact notification using one of our brands to protect the access and so on. So you see, there is not that easy the way that we will need to implement all those things. Then, is science a business? Yeah, on this food packaging, if you are able to translate this and you will get the green light to become a product, yeah, it's still a business. But when we need to analyze who is ruling, and then we see, yeah, the different global agencies or regional agencies or country or whatever, yeah, still is quite difficult to understand sometimes who is ruling and what needs to be applied and so on. Then the risk assessment, again, if I'm acting as a devil advocate for engineers, the case of Volkswagen we have been discussing a lot, no? That is being seen as a problem of ethics, somebody cheating on the emissions. Translate this into an engineering program. you are in the board of a company and you say to me, hey, we need to pass a test in a moment where the car is stopped, no movement is applied to the steering wheel, no gear will be, so we will be in neutral position and somebody will be pressing the gas, and then at that time they will be monitoring the emissions. Do you think I will not program this in a way that in this particular thing, when the sensor is detecting no steering, no gear engaged, I will put there a level of emissions that will not pass the test? This is impossible. So if you give this as a problem, we will find the solution of the problem. So give this level of emissions when no gear is engaged and when no movement is applied to the steering wheel. We will pass the test, always. So the thing is, we need to do tests that are really reproducing the problem that we want to measure. So what we want to measure is emissions during the normal using of a vehicle in a road and so on. This is what needs to be reproduced during the test, because if the test is a completely different one, as students, we have been trained to pass all the tests. And when we graduate, means that we have been able to pass all the tests. So this is just another test, and then we will pass it. So the checking on how the legislation is implemented needs to be done in a proper way, because if not, there is always ways to pass this, and not with the main purpose of cheating, but with the intellectual challenge of passing this test and to apply the conditions of the test and so on. So those scenarios and those rules needs to be properly checked. If not, we will have much more scandals like this, where the limits of what is the technical solution and what is the ethics of passing this technical solution are having a completely different debate. And then the opportunities and so on, we all like the sports, no? You see, the ratio of referees for football, so 22 players, 1 referee, and 2 auxiliary ones on the lines and so on. Ratio of referees while playing singles on Roland Garros. Yeah, you have 1 referee, you have all the people around for only 2 players. So you need much more people controlling than playing. So if this needs to be translated into rules for business, this is not a very nice thing. While if we go to one of the favorite hobbies for a lot of business people, golf. In golf, if you cheat, nobody will be playing with you. And cheating is not an option. So you have the rules, very complex rules. And you are recording, and when you are with your 4 friends playing and so on, if somebody cheats, it's out of the thing. You will never ever play with them. So cheating is not an option. While in football, everybody is trying to cheat and not to be catched by the camera. In tennis, we have now not only this big amount of referees and controllers, but we have also an eye camera providing the difference if the ball is in or out, and there are super actors saying, no, it's in or it's out or whatever. You see, there are sports that trying to control a lot with a super ratio of controllers versus players. The thing is that it's a value. It's almost a value among the players to try to cheat or to try to pass the rules. While in golf, with the number of referees is almost unexisting. It's only in official competitions that you will have referees. No? Nobody will accept cheating. So ideally, we will be needed to move the business scenario to one similar to the San Andreas rules for golf, where everybody needs to control themselves and cheating is not an option. While now what we are playing is something like football going into the direction of tennis. There will be more people controlling than people playing. So those are the different things. And also linked to this, on this comparison between products, applications, and countries, we know that in a market where there are a lot of players, food, this is a market with strong legislation. You go to a market with few business players, toothpaste, there is very weak legislation. So those anomalies needs to be corrected step by step. And compliance as an opportunity. Our company is now having more than 140 years of history. We started in 1884 and so on. And we are now planning, like everybody, our strategy until 2050. We were having a first milestone in 26, and we will have another milestone in 2030. So yeah, this is the scenario. There is the fossil-based technology that we will need to abandon, and the coexistence between. Okay, all those things, nice. But reality is that we take our business decisions with this scenario of that we need to have reserves for the next 100 years. So this compliance in terms of sustainability offers a window of opportunity to differentiate our products and our services from now to 2050. But for instance, on CO2 emissions, after 2050, the CO2 emissions discussion is gone. So for the next years, for this scenario that for us is covering until 2121 nowadays, from 50 to 121 will be still more than 70 years that needs to be covered in a slightly different way, where maybe sustainability or the CO2 emissions or all the things that now are hot topics are no longer there. So we need to go not only for today's scoring, like here the EcoVadis as example, but to something that is really more sustainable by definition and not linked to the hottest topic, the new fashion, or the new concept that we are trying to push through legislation or whatever. And then, just finishing, there is a clear link between this scientific development and translating this into IP and stronger legislation or application of democracy or whatever you want to define this. You check the IP in China or in USA is a completely different way. But you go to Switzerland. Switzerland is one of the most innovative ones, and that is where the democracy is having a slightly different application, where participation is really embedded on the right way of doing things and so on. So we are having referendums every month, more or less, and you vote everything, and kids on the school, they learn how to solve conflicts by applying democracy rules since the very first school. This leads that most of the IP and patents that are placed on the Swiss market are mostly cooperation between different firms, which is quite weird and quite different when you compare with other countries. So this right application of the democracy concepts with the voting, the consensus finding, and so on, allows Switzerland to be one of the world leaders in intellectual property based not on the single development of a single company, but on a consortium of different companies trying to find a solution for a given problem. So that's why these consensus finding, democratic rules, and so on are allowing a country to have this advantage, a competitive advantage, and so on, translated and so on. And a very weak application of the democracy rules, like in China or any other countries where the IP is not fully respected. So yeah, companies who will apply for a patent in those countries, so you don't go there. And last but not least, two things out of all those questions that for us are really working, and we will try to reinforce. This trying to analyze what is required on the regulatory frame from a very basic perspective. So this PAC, you check what is your product, what are the applications, and what is the country that you want to target, and this is the way to start. And last but not least, all those lobbying possibilities that now companies we are having directly or through associations, we try to base this on science to avoid what can be considered in terms of sustainability, greenwashing, or in other terms, a lobbying that is having the bad reputation. So this was our contribution, and really looking forward for some questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ernest. I really appreciate those practical insights and the challenges that the companies are facing, because depending on the sector and depending on the age also of the company, the challenges are very diverse. Kind of that's the biggest issue or the challenge that we're facing with sustainability. There's no one-size-fits-it-all approach, and that makes things even more complex. Okay, I would like to give the floor now for any questions, comments, thoughts about the presentation we just saw, directed straight to Ernest. If anybody has anything. Otherwise, I'm going to take the advantage of it again. No worries there. While we're waiting, if somebody else wants to ask something, I have a question that's kind of very typical for me, so you're used to me, you're going to be able to answer. What's the priority right now for OMIA? So given this avalanche of new legislative acts, and not just on sustainability, but also for your sector specifically, because it's always been kind of more regulated, right? Where are you starting now? How did you even decide as to where to start the transition and what to focus on? Because obviously you cannot do it all at the same time. So something has to go first. What is going first for you?
In year 2000, we moved our organization from a constellation of different legal entities worldwide to a matrix organization. So now we have group, and then we have 4 regions. And then on those regions, we have all the countries and so on. Now we are having 170 more or less production sites worldwide in 50-something countries. And this is our structure. This matrix structure has helped us a lot on these very difficult times, for instance, on the COVID. Try to issue a rule that fits in all countries. Impossible. You see, in some countries, Singapore, we need to measure temperature of our employees on the office at least 4 times per day. You try to go to our Cologne office and try to measure temperature, you will be stopped by the unions because you are going into the personal area of influence. So this is personal domain, you cannot measure temperature and so on. So you see, from these very basic things. What we have done is to implement the matrix structure also to look on the challenges. And then there are things that are company related and others that are country related and others that are product related and so on. Okay. If we go to sustainability, there is a company claim, for instance, neutrality, how to achieve this CO2 neutrality in 2050 and so on. There is where the whole company is aligned. And then when we go to the different market segments, because now we are from paper to polymers to consumer goods, environmental solutions, and construction materials. So those are our 5 market segments. So those market segments in different countries are triggering different priorities. And that's why we are balancing this way. What needs to be applied for the whole company and what needs to be applied to be able to be competitive in one application in a given country. So this, again, is the only way that allows us to give some priorities and differences.
An excellent answer. Just one little tiny thing, sorry. Now, when you're dealing with it, basically across your matrix, which is a great idea, actually, because it becomes manageable, something that was not manageable before. Can you still create an overall sustainability strategy for the whole corporate group? So despite the fact that you apply different principles and different approaches, for instance, across the matrix, can you have a coherent set of strategies in place that you're following as to the impact you have? Did I express myself well enough to know what I'm asking?
Perfect. Whatever coherent means, or whatever, this is we will learn later. No? What we are trying now, and you have seen the icon there, our main product is calcium carbonate, no? And the coccolith is the microscope snail that forms the structure of this when it's crystallizing and being precipitated into the sea and so on. So this is the way that calcium carbonate becomes available in nature. And we are using now this little logo that is a Nautilus. Nautilus is the biggest snail on nature, so it's the evolution from the microscope to the big one. And also Nautilus for the readers of Jules Verne. No? So Nautilus was this submarine that was in the futuristic approach and so on. This is what we are trying to have. No? From the tradition of our mining or fine chemicals and so on to the future that we are trying to have, this is where we are trying to develop the whole thing for the whole company and trying to have common elements for all of us that will give an answer to the common answers that all our stakeholders are having worldwide. And that's why there is this minimum common part that we all share. And then again, the only way is to derive it from this to go to the particular things that needs to be applied in different places. This is also linked with this tradition that we are having about the think global and act local. So is another way of trying to implement this nice slogan into reality. But the challenge to see if this is a good way or not is, sadly, the answer will only come later. So we'll see. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you very much, Ernest. This was very pleasurable. Thank you for your presentation and the comments. So we're on time, which is great. I'm very proud of us all. So the next up is Professor Onyeka Osuji, who's going to be speaking about a very interesting topic of deconstructing the sustainable consumption to figure out the way forward, right? So, Professor, are you ready? Beautiful. The slides are already there. Now we just need to hear you because we don't hear you yet, and then we're all set.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nina, and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to the conference. I've listened to previous presentations. I've enjoyed it all. So thank you. Today, I'll be talking about deconstructing sustainable consumption. Essentially, I think pretty everyone has heard about sustainable consumption. But what I'm going to say today is that the notion of sustainable consumption goes deeper than many people would think. And in a way, my presentation would share certain things in common with the previous one by Professor Hans Miklis in the sense of policy implications as well. So, just to explain one thing, and this is what I'm going to say now is essentially adapted from a book chapter I wrote in a book I edited. So if you look at the number of pages, it is actually a substantial chapter. So I'm going to try and summarize what I have in the chapter. And the plan of my presentation is 5. The first thing is I will try and talk about some terminologies just to make sure we are all on the same page as the way I'm using certain expressions. If you go back to where I started, my point was that the notion of sustainable consumption has been heard by many people, but the understanding is not quite common as the awareness. So, and at the end, we talk about some policy significance and implications of the points I will raise. So in terms of terminology, I would just want to highlight one thing, that consumer law and consumer protection law, they mean the same, essentially, in scholarship. They use the same word. So you can talk about consumer law, consumer protection law. But there is a difference between consumer law approach and consumer protection approach. Consumer law approach emphasizes more on individual autonomy, the need for information-based regulation, and that's to provide information for consumers. Whereas consumer protection law approach is more interventionist. So it goes beyond information, goes beyond the paradigms of the consumer autonomy in the consumer law approach. The second point I would like to highlight is that I know there are differences between sustainability as a concept and sustainable development as a concept. But I will be using both interchangeably. So when I want to talk about goal or the methods or processes, I can say sustainability and sustainable development. The second point in terms of interchangeable usage in the context of this paper is sustainable consumption. I know some people make a distinction between sustainable consumption as consuming less and ethical consumption as consuming differently, but for the context of this paper, both of them would mean the same. Whether you're consuming less or consuming differently, it would mean the same. Likewise, there can be a distinction between sustainable consumption and sustainable production. But here, I'll be using both together because they are seen as twins, one side, different sides of the same coin. So just a note of the terminologies I will be using. And moving on, I think everyone in the audience would agree that there is a clear link between consumption and sustainable development. Going back to the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development 1992, up to the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Guidelines for Consumer Protection 2016, all of these international instruments refer to consumption as an important component of sustainable development or sustainability, as one can see. But in these instruments, in law, in policy, in scholarship, one can see different approaches to the issue of responsibility. Who should be responsible for sustainable development? So here we're talking about consumers. So in terms of consumers, should they be responsible? How can they be responsible? So there are different approaches. And the first one is the essentialist. The essentialist simply tries to define sustainable development. One example I've given there is Article 49 of the UN Guidelines for Consumer Protection, talking about meeting the needs of the present and future generations. So more about explaining what it means. But in terms of responsibility, it is neutral, it is silent, although collective responsibility is implied in the explanation that we have to consume for the benefit of present and future generations. But it's not quite specific as to what consumers are supposed to do. So that is the essentialist. The performative approach sees consumers as institutional actors. So one of the segments of society that can affect other segments of society. So as an institution. So within the performative approach is the idea of individual responsibility of consumers for sustainable development. Although this is not quite explicit, it is implied. The third approach is descriptive. This is simply about giving an account of the conduct, the decisions, the thinking processes of consumers. It is neutral in terms of whether consumers have a responsibility or not, or whether someone else will have a responsibility. It's just there to show that, look, consumers actually can affect sustainable development through consumption. Then the fourth one? Yes, now is the existentialist approach to sustainable development or sustainable consumption. So this one is explicit on the individual responsibility of consumers. Consumers have that responsibility to advance sustainable development. It is part of the responsibility of a consumer as a member of society. And this is the dominant approach in scholarship and in policy, really. However, it is criticized by some for focusing a lot on consumers, on giving them responsibility. on changing consumers' attitudes, behavior, and choice, as Shove indicated in the quotation I put up on the screen. Shove 2010 talking about the ABC framework of consumer attitude, behavior, and choice, criticizing that and saying, what about the other segments of society? So that is the criticism of the existentialist approach to sustainable consumption. But at the same time, the criticism of the existentialist approach can also be criticized for going far by trying to absolve consumers from having responsibility. And that now takes us to the last approach, which is the middle ground of shared approach, or shared responsibility between consumers. So that middle ground would say that consumers have a role in sustainable consumption, but other segments of society, particularly law and policy, have a significant role to play in order for consumers to undertake sustainable consumption. And that role can also mean protecting consumers themselves. So I've got a quick graph to show that sustainable consumption focusing on consumers only is not quite the correct way to go about it, but showing that there is intricate linkage between law, policy, business, and consumers for consumers to be able to undertake sustainable consumption. And based on that shared responsibility approach, I've come up with what I would call the components of sustainable consumption. So there is no single meaning of sustainable consumption if one understands that there is an underlying shared responsibility approach to sustainable consumption. In that case, I've got the 6 foundational components, which I will talk about in a minute. Those 6 foundational components are supported by the need for contextualism. So they need to consider the institutional environment around the rules of consumer law, consumer protection law, around consumer protection bodies, around the enforcement of consumer rules. So those areas are part of sustainable consumption, depending on the particular environment being talked about. And likewise, certain issues can have transnational elements. Those transnational elements should be part of the consideration for law and policy if there is the desire to advance sustainable consumption. So moving on, with regards to those foundational components of sustainable consumption, the first one is the one that is widely acknowledged, which is that sustainable consumption is undertaken by present consumers for future generations. So for the benefit of future generations, the present generation is trying to live sustainable lifestyles, undertake ethical consumption, green consumption, fair trade, and so on, making decisions to protect the future generation. So what would that mean? It means that present generation of consumers will need information as to the impact of whatever they are doing regarding or on future generations. So they need that information. They need to be told, look, you are likely to have an impact on the future generations. So that is the first part. But the other part as well is sustainable production for future generations. So that is the counter part of sustainable consumption by present consumers for future generation. A sustainable production. So producing, providing products and services with the mind that the future generations need to be protected. A lot of times, people, when they want to talk about sustainable production, they focus on business as well, on business, without also considering that consumers can also be empowered to drive sustainable production, giving them sufficient education to know they can drive, whether by overt or covert action, they can drive production patterns. The third component of sustainable consumption, in my view, would be sustainable consumption by present consumers for the benefit of present consumers. So this is about self-interest. A lot of times when we talk about sustainable consumption, this part is sort of ignored, but there is also that self-interest of consumers in sustainable consumption, so efficiency for their benefit, and them understanding the need to avoid wasteful consumption. So this does not score highly in terms of consumer law with regards to sustainable consumption, but it is part of sustainable consumption. Then the fourth part is sustainable production for present consumers. So that's the counterpart or the other side of the coin. So what I've just said, making sure production or products and services are not harmful, whether to the social or economic or the health, well-being of consumers, or present consumers. So that is part of sustainable consumption. And how can that be? In different ways. Example, making sure they've got access to education, making sure affordability, and making sure that there is no irresponsible marketing of products. Then the fifth component of sustainable consumption is allowing participation by present consumers, whether in policy discussions, whether in enforcement of consumer protection rules and standards. So that element of participation is critical to sustainable consumption. So, and the participation can also be in terms of private law rights, in terms of being able to be, having the opportunity to be represented by stakeholders or stakeholder organizations. That is participation. And the last component of sustainable production is consumption, in my view, is corporate social responsibility. Earlier, I think one of the audience mentioned sustainability claims of companies being false and misleading. This is part of what I'm talking about here. Recognizing that corporate social responsibility, corporate claims about social responsibility, they are all part of sustainable production, sustainable consumption. And if there is law and policy initiative in that regard, then that should also incorporate consideration of corporate social responsibility. How do you encourage companies to behave in a socially responsible manner without forcing them? And when they make claims, how do you ensure that those claims are accurate, they're not misleading? If if those aspects are ignored, then there is a huge gap in sustainable consumption. So that is the point of this aspect. Because at the end of the day, there is power imbalance between consumers and business. And there's also information asymmetry between consumers and business. So bearing that in mind, there is the need to intervene where relevant in the area of corporate social responsibility. So I will now move on to the final point. So in summary, what are the policy significance and implications of understanding that the notion of sustainable consumption is a more complex subject? The first one is what the point I made at the beginning, or I sort of made at the beginning, that the consumer law approach on autonomy of consumers, the ability to make decisions with information, that approach is not suitable for promoting sustainable consumption. So the more interventionist consumer protection law approach seems more suitable, and that would include recognizing that consumers can be vulnerable in certain areas, recognizing the need for their private law rights, recognizing the need for stakeholder rights and responsibilities to complement administrative enforcement in issues relating to sustainable consumption. But in all this, disclosure can be used, but it should not be the sole method, but rather it should be one of the ingredients of regulation for sustainable consumption. And the other point is, with regards to claims, whether made by businesses directly or indirectly through rating agencies, certification schemes, labeling schemes, assurance schemes, that there should be, or there might be the need to regulate those claims to ensure that they are accurate, they are not misleading for consumers, because those claims are important for consumers to undertake sustainable consumption. And consumer education matters. So it's not simply about this is what sustainable consumption means, but it should be wide-ranging as to what they can do, the rights that they have in different ways. And the final point there is context matters. So I've talked about the quality of rules, of standards, of enforcement, of formal institutions. Those aspects, they do matter a lot, and they should be part of the consideration in terms of law and policy for sustainable consumption. I'm going to end it here, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was truly all-encompassing, actually. Like, out of that, we could have another debate for 5 hours, I think. I will first try to be kind and put the floor and to any of the participants who have any particular questions for Professor. And then I will start with the debate and the questions. So does anybody have any questions, something that they would like to comment about the presentation itself or any of them? Today, everybody's a bit sleepy. What is happening? So I'll go, not a problem. As regards to starting from sustainable development, I have one not so tricky, but still tricky question for you. Do you personally believe, seeing your presentation, that sustainable development as a notion or two notions combined in one is actually possible? And I refer to the fact that development, as it's been described right now with legal and economic theories as they are up until now, is endless growth, right? So I'm going to challenge you a little bit and ask what is your personal opinion about whether that term can actually exist or the two different terms that encompass it can be reconciled. I would really, really like to hear your opinion on that.
Oh, thank you, Lila. I think the first thing I would say is it is important to have a goal in whatever one is doing. But the second thing to note is that to achieve that goal, it may not be possible, but it's still important to have that goal.
Okay.
And the same way some of us who are academics, when we say, oh, you've done very well, you've done very well would not mean you've gotten 100% of the mark. You've done everything required. 70% can be a huge success. So in that regard, I think some people would call sustainability as the goal, okay? As the goal. If you see sustainability as the goal, and so far as people live, people work, people produce, people consume, it's unlikely you're going to have sustainability in that sense because people will continue to be active, to produce, to consume, on and on. So as an absolute term, sustainability is a goal that can be achieved up to a degree. So that's how I put it. But in terms of sustainable development, some of those methods or processes encompassed in that notion of sustainable development, they can be achieved. So my answer would be, at the end, it depends.
Yeah, like our answers usually are, specifically in the field of sustainability. Then relating to what you just said, it would be interesting for me to ask you, do you think we already have tools at our disposition to limit this consumption and production? Because the majority of the unsustainability of the system is the amount of consumption and production. Specifically, if I apply it, I don't know, to a recent research field from my side, it was fashion industry, right? Okay, great. If we're consuming a lot and we're asking for more production, beautiful. But our consumption consists of actually consuming the 15% that we're buying and discarding the almost 85% in total of what we bring home. So there's an issue. We're not using what we're supposed to use, right? So we have goods that are not satisfying our needs. How do we tackle that? Do you think, in your professional opinion, we do have the tools to do so right now, to limit that consumption and to limit that cycle of basically buying but not consuming at the end of the day?
I think there is no single tool. If I go back to my presentation, if one understands that, let's say, sustainable fashion, for instance, as a desire, there is no single tool. So being able to talk about, if I go back to that picture I presented, government, law, policy, business, consumers. So as government, as law and policy, what do you have to do? Making sure there are rules in place to encourage business to undertake sustainable production, incentives for them to do so. These incentives for them to refrain from unsustainable production, and moving on to consumers, giving them the education they need, really, because some people don't, at the moment, no matter what we say, a lot of people still don't know the impact of what they do. They don't know that individual action can have an impact. They don't know how they can collectively make an impact. So increase the level of consumer education and provide them certain rights as well. So again, what I can say is the tools are not yet there. So what we have in place really different institutions looking at the issue from one side without looking at a more complete picture of involving government, public institutions, business, consumers, and even stakeholder organizations in the entire process. So my answer would be not there, but awareness is increasing.
Exactly, thank you very much. So your last comment was very topical for this event. So for the previous edition and this edition, no matter the field, which is very surprising, or on the other hand, not surprising, right? No matter the field we're dealing with, policy coherence and the solutions, the coherence of the solutions that we have across the regulation as regards sustainability, it's kind of the biggest challenge. Because thank God we have managed to surpass the boundary of saying sustainability has no role inside business law and then consumer protection and then competition law. So that barrier has been breached, which is great, right? But instead of building this new system in terms of we understand 2 steps ahead and we understand that the instruments plus the rights in the instruments need to be coherent amongst themselves, we kind of created these separate systems that are giving us new challenges, I believe. Like, I welcome those solutions, but as you said, the issue is here that they are very unrelated sometimes, those solutions, and it's difficult to understand how to behave. So now if I pinpoint on consumer behavior, first of all, like you stress, and this is very important, we don't have the information necessary. But on the other hand, we have to be careful too, to not overload the consumer with information that's not relevant, because that kind of diminishes his possibility of choice too, right? We have all seen it, like we're these children of abundance, so we can have whatever you want, but if you decide that you want to buy a TV, for example, the choice is not easy right now. What you find yourself is watching online to the extent that you don't know what to buy anymore, because you find new solutions every day, right? That's also overconsumption. But in those terms, there's a bit of a paternalizing role of regulation, also saying what you should know, right? So it's not just disclosure, like you mentioned in one of your slides. It's not just disclosure in general as much as you can and let's go, but it's more kind of targeted disclosure as to what matters. So here, I want to ask you, do you have opinion on that as to what information exactly should the consumer get to not be overloaded, but to be informed? And of course, that still kind of keeps, to a certain extent, the business secrecy of the companies. Have you thought about that notion already? And the question actually goes to all the panelists and all the presenters, but first, of course, to you. Have we thought about it already, how to play this paternalizing role, which is not very welcome, huh?
Thank you. I share your views, actually, because when people talk about information, the way things work is people talk about information and it becomes the big thing. And then suddenly, people realize information becomes the problem. Information provided. Because at the same time, you can see business will be able to exploit information in that sense, use that to influence consumer behavior. So the first thing is, if, for instance, I think it goes back really to what I said about understanding those foundational elements. So if you want to, the information is about, this is for your benefit. If you don't eat this or eat that, then let it be clear that it's not about, oh, this is for sustainable development, or we have this mark of sustainability in general terms. But if this is about maybe drinking this bottle of water, saying there, drinking this bottle of water costs you more, why don't you drink tap water? Clearly, in a language everyday average consumer would understand. This is just about your benefit. No pretense at some big goal. So it's about your benefit, or the benefit of your children or grandchildren, whatever. Make it clear that way. And if there are some rights available to the consumer, clearly say that you have so and so right to do this, or not to do that. And if this happens, you can do this clearly. So for me, it should be being clear as to the purpose of that information, not bringing everything to go together to say, oh, we've got this green mark. So green mark, what does that mean? Red mark, what does that mean? So if the green is about, there's an alternative which is cheaper. Let it be clear to the consumer, rather than saying this is green. So that's one example.
This is an interesting idea. Let me just jump for a second in, because I just remembered that now there are initiatives at the level of EU Commission, but also on the level of national law, to have the same marking and grading system as we have for quality of food we're consuming, for sustainability of goods. Not a bad thing necessarily, right? So kind of this paternalism also topic becomes a bit less relevant, because it is very clearly and easily put for the consumer, something that has been in a very complicated manner calculated by science. Meaning that you have this beautiful translation, right, of scientific language and the impact as we are aware of it right now, because by far our methods are not perfect, but you have this beautiful translation of the scientific goals and aims and calculations into regular consumer language. So it exactly pertains to your last comment of saying, let's make it simple, but it also needs to be all-encompassing as to the information or the impact we, as legislators, let's say, are trying to, right, have, which is a beautiful thing. So I hope that this kind of labeling of products from being the most sustainable having label A, and then the least sustainable having label D, is kind of the first try, right, to try and convey this information.
Yeah. I think what I can comment there is, I'm still a little bit, I will be a bit wary of A to E or green to red sort of classification on sustainable, unsustainable. So someone like me can say, okay, you have this green code and different columns for, green, red, yellow, all that, and then you've got rows and rows. So green, is it in terms of being wasteful, costing you money? Is it in terms of you are protecting the future generation? So, and that way the people may understand it, because some of these things is, some of what we talk about, sometimes we have that coincidence of our present needs, our benefit, and future generations. But people don't see that sometimes. So if that is the message, let it be part of the green thing. But labeling everything sustainable or unsustainable, in my view, because of how I try to unpack those 6 components, it will still create confusion as to what exactly, for a student, for a consumer, what do you mean by sustainability here?
Yeah, of course, but we're also basing this on predisposition that we believe that everybody's values are the same, which is also not, right? We have a problem with consumer. I would just like to give a word to Ernest, who has been so patiently waiting, I'm sorry, to this individual discussion of ours. Ernest, please go.
No, thank you very much. And it's really interesting, and that's why I needed to jump in, because this is one of my favorite topics. Excess of production, as you were saying, all this amount of TVs, most of those TVs will disappear from the market if they are not accepted by consumers. So we don't need to add an extra layer, maybe, of regulation on this. Market rules will immediately make the natural selection of the products that are being offered. If we go to the extreme, the same will apply to consumers. If you buy a lot of TVs and so on, you will be bankrupt and you will disappear as a consumer. No? But reality is that this is quite unbalanced, because there will be always a bigger amount of consumers than producers in every market. So that's why when you were talking about the coherence among all stakeholders. Because as I said, between producers and consumers, quite unbalanced in numbers and on power. And the purchasing power has been always neglected. And then 2 points. One is the information. Now we discuss about COVID vaccines like football teams or car producers. Everybody knows who is producing the COVID vaccine that you will receive or you have received or you can receive or whatever. Does it lead to a much better consumer behavior? I have my doubts. So information alone, I don't know if it's always the right thing, because here you have much more information than ever. Never ever in my life I knew who was producing the vaccines that I was receiving.
Yes.
I've been vaccinated since child, and never ever I was having this. Now I'm having this. There is a lot of passionate discussions about this. I'm having a better consumption pattern through this new layer of information that I'm having. I don't know. And last but not least, as a consumer, there is legislation, and on a lot of pieces of legislation, there is always a fine or something. Here in Switzerland, what we have is that you pay for the bags of your garbage. For most of us immigrants, it's a super contrast. You see, I was living in Barcelona. You produce more garbage, you put 2 bags, you go down. If you have a sustainability approach, you will do recycling, that's it. Now I live in Canton Zurich. You need to buy the official plastic bag. No garbage can be disposed without this official plastic bag because you will be fine. Huh? And then the bags are quite expensive. So you try immediately to reduce the amount of things that you are trashing. So there are different instruments that can be applied to lead to a much more responsible consumption. But only to have a balanced thing, going more to punish who is placing the product on the market or the producer and neglecting the potential benefits of doing something more on the consumers, maybe this is not the right way. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ernest. I think it's a comment, and I agree. The whole thing is about understanding complexity, and not simply saying, oh, we've got this solution, because there is no the solution. There's no this solution, but you can have different things targeting different aspects, like the example you gave about Switzerland now. Maybe education hasn't worked very well by telling people reduce your distance, but making them know that if you consume a lot, you are going to pay. And that's some sort of education, really, by making you to buy those plastic bags is some sort of education, telling you, oh, you're spending money. But if somebody is doing some TV program and showing, social media, say, oh, it's costing you, people may not understand it that way, but that is actually an effective of saying, your pocket is affected by how much you bring in. So do you really need to bring in all this for them to go into a plastic bag? So you pay for the product, pay for the plastic bag. So it's part of education in that sense of it. So I agree with you totally. Thank you. Good comments.
I would just add one last comment on that, because I was living in Netherlands and they have the same system, right? I think the first generation, for the first or maybe the second generation, this is educational exercise. I think it starts being embedded in the culture. Because if you think about it, the way you teach your kids then, don't throw that, that is expensive. They have this predisposition that they completely internalize of saying, oh, throwing is bad because throwing costs money. It's a ridiculous X to Y link, but it actually becomes embedded in the culture. So nobody in his sane mind in Netherlands thinks about throwing the trash or too much trash outside or not recycling, or it's not even in their scope of thinking. So you as a foreigner, you come there and you're shocked about their system, they're shocked about yours. Where did you want to throw that? I'm sorry, I kind of come from Slovenia. So the fact was that it works because it's embedded in the culture then. So those I think, the solutions that we're searching for, that at first it has an impact on what hurts most. And right now, what hurts most is money. And then in the second stage, it has an impact on the culture. So I would welcome solutions to that effect. And I think it's a really interesting way of thinking. How can you, by imposing some fines or some economic these benefits at this moment influence the culture of the next generation? Yeah, Ernest, go.
No, it was just to agree. It was the clapping hands
Okay.
that I was trying to. Thank you very much.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you very much, Ernest. Thank you very much, Professor Osuji. Now we are finishing basically with the last contribution, which I would say that's kind of a closing speech because we're going to touch upon the topic of certification. So we have a very welcome guest from Quebec, Canada, who has adapted his schedule right now heavily to ours. So thank you once again, Pierre Courtemanche. We would invite you to speak to us a little bit about your experience right now and as regards certification and the way things work in your field. So Pierre, if you're with us.
Yes, I am. I hope you are hearing me well.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Leila. So hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be in touch with you. So as Leila mentioned, welcome to my home. I am in Quebec City, Canada. It's 7:30 in the morning. It's raining today, it's dark, and I'm very happy to join the group. So I will talk about certifications and sustainable consumption choices. But before, I will start by reading a short story. I know that everyone loves stories. So it goes like this. So on June 15, 2015, the French Minister of the Environment, Ségolène Royal, called for a boycott of Nutella produced by Ferrero, citing the massive deforestation associated with palm oil, one of the 5 main constituents of the spread. The next day, Ferrero reacts by saying that all the palm oil the brand consumes is RSPO certified and segregated. On June 16, the Italian political class comes to the defense of Ferrero, and the next day, Minister Royal presents public apology, saying she agrees to highlight the progresses made by Ferrero. But the story does not end there. I was told in 2017, Ferrero noticed that for the first time since Nutella was released in 1949, sales have stopped growing and are even declining in some markets. Panic at Ferrero, who surveys consumers and finds that the decline in sales is directly linked to the negative perception children and mothers have of palm oil and its negative environmental impacts. So the campaign to save the orang-outan is working. Ferrero top management mobilized its teams. It is necessary to restore the image of the mark of the product which made the company so prosperous. The marketing and sustainable development teams are at work, while on the sustainable side, actions in the field, monitoring deforestation, and traceability back to plantations are proposed. Marketing is suggesting the adoption of a second certification, the voluntary rainforest standard, which will cost 5 times as much to deploy. This story is fantastic, to my opinion. All the issues and challenges of sustainable development and responsible consumptions can be found there. I will use this story and a jar of Nutella to answer the following questions. What available information allows consumers to make an informed choice about the sustainability of a product? So let us start with the product packagings and the label, our first source of information. So what do we have here? So when I look at that, we have some catchy marketing. I have information on the product. So I'm being told that this is a spread with hazelnut and cocoa. What else do I have? I have a barcode. If I scan it with my phone, I will obtain no other information than the global trade identification number. What else? I have the best before. And then I have a list of ingredients with some nutrition facts. It's about that. I have if I have some questions, I have the list of ingredients, the nutrition facts, and that's it. That's all I have. So what can we learn from the information on the packagings and labels? So there are two categories of informations. Those provided by the product brand owner, in this case Ferrero, and those required by the country's regulatory body where the product is sold. So this one was sold in Canada, I purchased it in Quebec City. So it means that the informations, the mandatory informations that we have on this product, because it is in Canada, will be different from what you will have in the EU and, of course, in other countries. We can say that today, mandatory labeling aims to protect consumers against two risk categories. One, false and misleading advertising, and two, health and safety. What about the sustainability performance of a good? Nothing really exists on the mandatory side. This is mainly because there is no international or national consensus on sustainability principle and criteria that can be translated into specific labels and mentions. The field is open to brand owner with the only obligations not to mislead consumers. They must be creative in distinguishing their products from others' brands while remaining honest with their claims. The ice is thin, and many falls into greenwashing by inserting informations and statements that are not true or credible. In conclusion, I can say that packaging and labeling do not currently provide consumers with a new type of experience to discover and compare products' sustainability attributes. So there is, when you look at this Nutella jar, you can say that it is a highly risk product because 4 of the 5 main ingredients have major sustainability issues. Palm oil with deforestation and biodiversity loss, cocoa with child labor, decent living wages and deforestation, hazelnut mainly coming from Turkey with human trafficking and forced labor, and sugarcane with forced labor and decent living wages. Another thing that we can find on this packaging is a QR code. So, and more, the brand owner will use QR code to provide additional information because, of course, it is quite limited. So they will use this QR code to provide additional information. So if we scan the QR code, it will bring us to a web page where we get information on the product, the sustainability initiative, quality and the ingredients, and recipes. If I click on the sustainability tabs, that opens another web page where we find Ferrero's commitment on sustainability and their commitment for the 4 critical raw materials. We can read that, as Ferrero speaking, we strive to continuously improve the responsible sourcing of raw materials along our supply chain to enhance the living conditions of farmers and their communities and foster sustainable practices that protect natural resources. We collaborate with partners, NGOs, and other institutions to bring these missions to life on a daily basis. They tell us that they have a social responsibility and execute programs designed to support local people in tackling agricultural, social, environmental, and economic issues related to the cultivations of our 4 main raw materials. These programs combine the development of specific projects, partnerships, and the adoptions of standards and certifications, as well as institutional and collective engagements. We can learn more on their CSR report. But seriously, can we expect that consumers have the time and the knowledge to form an opinion on the CSR report published by brands on a yearly basis? These reports are often follow reporting frameworks such as the GRI and the SASB. These frameworks aim to showcase how the company adds value to society, environment, and economy in an organized and standardized, transparent way to its stakeholders, including the public. The big problem is that these CSR and ESG reports, the same thing, are more focused on explaining the strategies and policies brands are taking to make their product and their production processes more sustainable, rather than the sustainability outcomes of those processes themselves. It is then easy to fall into greenwashing risk. Last week, the French brand Adidas has been found guilty of making false and misleading sustainability claims by France advertising ethics jury in relation to the recycling content of their Stan Smith shoes. Interesting to note that also UK and the Netherlands authorities have pledged to crack down on greenwashing with new penalties from 2022. So if consumer cannot find the expected information on labels and in report, can they rely on eco-labels and voluntary standards? So on that, we can say that in 1988, the first fair trade label by Max Havelaar was applied to pack of Mexican coffee sold in Dutch supermarket. At that time, using a product label to say something about standard in a supply chain was revolutionary, but today it is routine. The Eco-Label Index lists currently 463 certification schemes in 199 countries. So, with using the QR code in the web page, what kind of certifications Ferrero uses? So, Rainforest for cocoa, RSPO for palm oil, Bon Sucre for sugarcane, and nothing for hazelnut. A standard is a vision of a group of people and organizations on sustainability. It is made of compromises and trade-off. You set principles and criteria. Who are the supply chain actors and who must be certified? How compliance against the requirements will be assessed and by who? Which internal management system is required? What is the traceability system to implement? What are the conversion factors? How to make a product claim? And up you go. So let us have a closer look at Ferrero standards. So if I take cocoa, which mainly comes from West Africa, Ivory Coast, and Ghana, they say that they use the Rainforest Voluntary Standard. But to be true, they used to use the UTZ standard, which is the kind of the new, what's the new standard? It's much if I take a rainforest. So Rainforest was founded in 1987 and UTZ in 2002. So UTZ is a more recent standard, and UTZ has been very aggressive, making more compromises with the brands. So UTZ gains ground very rapidly, and Rainforest lost ground. So like in any, we have two non-for-profit companies, so you cannot buy a non-for-profit company. So what happened? Rather than competing, they said we should merge. So 2 years ago, UTZ and Rainforest has merged, and they decided to use the Rainforest label, which is most well-known. So this certification, UTZ certification and Rainforest certification started more than 20 years ago in West Africa. And at that time, companies like Ferrero and others commit to have 100% of their cocoa beans certified by 2025, but which is not the case today. So the problem is that certifications, traceability requirements are so weak that it is, and the way that those requirements are set up, it is absolutely possible that even if I'm being told that this is 100% certified, all the cocoa beans in this product is 1% certified, that I have no cocoa bean certified in this jar. It is absolutely possible, and it is aligned with the Rainforest standard. Why is that? Because when you need to start somewhere when you implement certifications, and you cannot with a product like cocoa beans that 4 million tons a year of cocoa beans are produced, over 4 million tons. You cannot expect that from the day to the other, everybody will be certified. So you know that it will be a long journey, and that the certified material will progressively increase the quantity available. So what you do is that you accept the fact that non-certified and certified material will be mixed and processed, so that this is the concept of mass balance. And in mass balance, to gain the, to engage the onboarding of private brands, the standard setters like Rainforest Woods and others, the same thing with palm oil, and it's the same thing with cotton, and the same thing with timbers. You accept that the claim, how to make the claim that when for a large company, they can have, let's say, 3 factories making this Nutella in Canada, and let's say that they use a third for all the equivalent bean, they use a third of certified beans. Then even if the manufacturing is only happening in 2 manufacturers with the certified beans, the third manufacturer is allowed to put on his label, contain certified, making a percentage claim is what we say, to say that this product contains a certified bean. So this is what we call the group level mass balance. So this is the problem for cocoa. For palm oil, RSPO, it's another type of certifications where a group of stakeholders, rather than an NGO, a group of stakeholders set up its own vision of sustainable development. So we all know that RSPO was initiated by Unilever. It was funded in 2004, and it's a group of stakeholders having stakes in the supply chains that say that we will propose a standard for the industry. Ferrero say, and this is what we learned in the story with Ségolène Royal, the French Minister of the Environment, say that, wait a minute, we use RSPO certified and 100% segregated, which is true. Ferrero is the only, to my knowledge, the only brand to use 100% segregated palm oil to produce its Nutella spread, which had necessitated huge investment for Ferrero to do that. The problem with the RSPO certification is that, let's take Indonesia, which is the main producers with Malaysia. You have, in Indonesia, you have 4 million smallholder producers, and the number is increasing. And they produce about 40% of the palm oil fruit. And this number is increasing as well. Since 2004, so after nearly 20 years, there is less than 1% of the smallholder farmers who are certified. So then who are certified? It's the big company and their industrial plantation. So when you say that you are RSPO segregated certified, means that your palm oil should come from big plantations, and then you need to trust to make the statement that these processing mills did not process any palm oil coming from smallholder farmers, which is almost impossible. I don't know if you ever been to Indonesia and see how the palm oil industry is working. The processing capacities are very important, and you can have during a day over 80 to over 100 20 tons trucks coming in to deliver the palm oil. So to ensure that they are only coming from the industrial plantation and that there is no truck coming from containing smallholder palm oil, it is a claim very hard to justify unless you have what we call traceability back to plantation, which is not the case currently. Bon Sucro, it's about the same type of standards. So it's a group of stakeholders who have joined together to set up their own vision of sustainability. It's rather a new standard. So what we can say is that certifications, standards have certainly done a lot to make supply chain more transparent over the past a couple of decades, but many people and organizations are now questioning their role and the real impact they have. Sustainability standards, as I've tried to explain briefly, are so complicated that it is very difficult for the non-initiated to navigate. Consumers trust the presence of the logo on the product they buy without understanding the scope and meaning. There is a need for consumers to distinguish not only what each certification's label entails, but also how trustworthy it is. I heard Frank Mars from the Mars Company said in an opening keynote speech at the World Cocoa Foundation Partnership meeting held in Washington in 2010, that the only thing we succeeded to certify is poverty. Many NGOs and certifications bodies act as watchdog and often play a key role, an important role. But who watch the watchdog? Can we think of an independent ranking system to attribute a score to a given certification label for consumers to understand the true implications of the label they see on their products? I will conclude here, and I would like to have more time to have exchange with you. So what, from my opinion, from my perspective, consumers have access to incomplete and fragmented information, which is of limited use when it comes time to make a choice on a product. Consumers, therefore, have no other options than to make an effort to find out about the social and environmental issues behind a product and a brand. But where to put the bar for consumer responsibility? It is true that buying is voting, but there are some growing constraints. Let me indicate three. The constant erosion of household purchasing power, illiteracy and functional illiteracy, and manipulations of individual choice independence with technology. We need to picture this globally and not only in developed countries. A significant portion of the population simply cannot educate themselves on the sustainability of the product they buy because they cannot read or understand the issues. For these people, the price paid is the only criterion that matters. My closing remarks. For labeling, current regulations and supervisions are not adapted to the present context and need to be updated. Similar observations can be made on voluntary certifications, how to control the quality of the certifications that are issued and continue to grow, possibly by using some type of ranking system, as I said, managed by independent organizations, or by continuously eliminating any low-quality certification. Scrutinize companies' claims and reports to ensure they are not misleading consumers and apply sanctions when justified. Finally, we absolutely need more regulations established by independent bodies working at international, regional, and local levels. But above all, do we really need this type of product? Yeah. Can we state that a snack like Nutella is a public good? On the one hand, we have serious sustainability issues associated with raw materials, and on the other hand, diabetes and overweight issues associated with snack consumptions. The impact on public health and economy is large. Let's take the example of Mexico. Overweight accounts for 8.9% of health expenditures and lowers labor market outputs by the equivalent of 2.4 million full-time workers' day per year. Combined, this means that overweight reduces Mexico GDP by 5.3%, the largest impact of all countries. Thank you. I will stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions and to discuss anything I have addressed on certifications and consumption choice.
Thank you so much, Pierre. This was extremely enlightening. I think that people that are not dealing every day with sustainability issues have not been aware of 3/4 of the things that you just explained on a simple jar of Nutella. I want to also thank you for the comment that you just made on, which is a very sensitive question, but I completely agree with you. Do we need a product like this? It's not harmful in one way, but it's harmful in 7,000 ways. So why is it still allowed to be sold? But then again, the topic of paternalism comes in, and we don't have the whole day to start answering it. But thank you very much for the little notes and the big picture that you just created for us. So before I start with any of my questions, I would kindly ask the audience if you want to ask Pierre something, or if you want to comment, add something. Ernest, please go.
Sorry, but I was in this panel, so I need to use and yes, as you are saying, for the ones in sustainability, this is daily bread. So this is what we are dealing with every day. So if we start with the hierarchy of claims, yeah, I'm having a program. I'm paying to one of my certification bodies 300 audit days per year. I'm covering 18 ISO different standards. And on top of this, I'm reporting to 5 or 6 brand owners on their relative standard. We are reporting on EcoVadis, on CDP, on SEDEX, you name it. Almost every reporting is around 3 weeks FTE effort to be reported. But again, if you classify how good they are completely different. You cannot compare. And as Pierre was saying, at the end, everything looks like it's the same. It's not the same. It's not the same. By far, they are not the same. So we need to have a clear hierarchy of claims to say, hey, this is a different level than this. Like we have, again, in football, no? There is the Champions League, and you are in this, or you are in regional leagues, or you are not that good. So this needs to be. But then, second, this needs to also target what we are targeting. So the hierarchy of targets. And this is linked also to this never-ending discussion in sustainability about rich countries, poor countries. Yeah, deforestation is a problem. But Madame Ségolène Royal was targeting this, but we have on the back, this is La Champagne. You see, this is where we started 140 years ago. 140 years ago, this was not like this. This was full of forest and so on, and Now, La Champagne is vineyards for champagne. So where is the biodiversity? Where is the forest and so on? So we, in some countries, we have had the right to deforest everything and to change and to do one single product way of earning our life and a good life. And we are now using our power to say to others, no, you don't have the same right. Yeah. Okay. This is always the discussion between the poor and the rich and who writes the rules and so on. And the other point that was related is, yeah, again, we go back to the personal decision. So it's easy to target this and to start a big thing about the consumption of chocolate spreads, but chocolate is again going up. Now during the pandemics, people has been eating chocolate and spreads and snacks and so on. And there is again our personal responsibility. Do we need more information to understand that a snack is not main priority? Do we need more information to understand that a snack is not good for our health? But we play with this, and it's easy to put the responsibility out of our basket and to put on others, while on our own responsibility and overweight is a clear example. We know that we are doing something bad, but so those are, for me, the 3 points. Hierarchy of claims, definition of targets, because it's easy to establish a target. Yeah. Why we are not targeting lithium? Now everybody is so happy to have a computer with long battery, with a mobile with long battery, electric cars and so on. Yeah, where is lithium coming? So, but we are targeting and releasing campaigns based on some interests that sometimes are not that clear. So this hierarchy of target establishing maybe based on science and maybe based on what is more harmful for the society in one place or another. And last but not least, to put this hierarchy of claims, hierarchy of targets, and personal responsibility. Without this, we will be discussing, but no impact will be achieved. So, thank you.
Can I react?
Thank you, Ernest. Yes, you can go. You can go, Pierre. Go ahead.
So, thank you, Ernest. I agree with what you are saying, and I can. I have a lot of empathy for you to have to produce all those reports and answers all the demand of your customers, which creates a lot of work and a lot of confusion in your team, and most of your team are passing their time to fill out reports, and for me, the situation is getting ESG report. We have now more than 600 different ESG reports. So an ESG, to my opinion, is taking over certification. And it makes no sense. So I can state that the way it is going now, ESG is killing sustainability. As I said, rather than putting the emphasis on how you report, why don't, as you suggest, Ernest, why don't we focus on the outcomes, the impact you have? I don't care about how you report, it's not the most important things, but what is important is are you reducing your consumption of water, of energy? How many children are going to school? Are they eating well? How many people are in good health and things like that? And this is what I would like to see rather than nice report and nice flashy statements and things like that. I will tell you a story. I was visiting a garment industry and I noticed that the red fire extinguisher, they were on the rail. And I asked the guy, I said, why they are on the rail? He said, because on one standard, they say they should be at 1 meter. And for another standard, it's 1.2 meters. So depending who is coming for the audit, we move the extender. See, this is crazy. So we need to have mention on this, because if everybody is rainforest certified, as you said, it's not right that all the brands are investing the same resources and are having the same success, but this is not translating on the logo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pierre. It's very clear that we're set up against quite some challenges that we're resolving sometimes in a very, very, very complex manner. I'm welcoming now Laura Best with her question, and then right after Laura, there is Rok.
Yes, thank you very much, Pierre. I thought that your presentation sketched exactly the complexity and multidimensionality of consumer protection and sustainability. So I really enjoyed it. Just 3 aspects to ask you to comment on, perhaps. What do you see as the role of consumer groups on the ground for monitoring and testing? Lessons from how you've probably piloted that. And then any experiences with using digital tools, for example, putting a QR code on a product, because even, around the world, we all kind of the uptake of smart devices is so great that I think it's so difficult to get all the information onto a label, as you were suggesting. But with a QR code and things like that, I think there is some scope for that. And then lastly, would you have any comment, though, on the reality that in many informal sector markets, the original packaging is removed in order to make quantities available that are more appropriate for people of smaller incomes. So when consumers do, in fact, get many of the products, there are no labels on them. And so there's that information gap that happens. And there's no obligation on those sellers to actually provide the information. And it's very complex in those informal markets to do that. So just your thoughts on how do you apply some of the regulations that are needed and the information provision in those very informal market settings. But thanks again, great presentation.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for your first questions. I think that consumer groups has a key role to play as watchdog, and that they are. Do you know that in 1,000 years ago, it was necessary in England to put the seal of the bakery on the bread loaf because it was a concern to know who are producing the bread. So 1,000 years ago, things like that was possible, and maybe we have lost visibility over time. But consumer groups need to protect the right of consumers, and I think one of my suggestions is that we need to scrutinize the claims and the reports of the brands and take actions against them where they are misleading. And I think that consumer group has a great role to do on this. Regarding technology, I I'm now retired, so my last company was an IT company offering traceability services, solutions in complex supply chains. Currently, like when I scan this QR code here, I give more information to the brand as a consumer than the brand is giving to me.
Yeah.
And I receive no money for that. You know, I'm not rewarded for that. I said that one of the big constraints I see is that they manipulate our consumption choice using technology. You know that if you shop for some ski, even if you are in summer, everything you will browse on your computers and you will receive notification of ski or pole or boots. And because they know exactly what you have visited, they sell the data to other brands and advertising companies, and they know where you are, they know when you buy it or when you look at advertising. So it is true that, and we have some technology, some solutions currently on the market, some mainly in Europe. We have some apps, some disruptive company startup that propose apps that will use your expenditures. They will use your wallet, your bank account to see what you purchase, and they will inform you on your the evolution of your choices. So some of those apps will calculate the carbon emissions. Others will focus on other sustainability issues. But we have something there very interesting. But currently, there is more threat for the consumer than good things.
Benefits, yeah.
On your third questions about it is absolutely true. You know, I lived many years in Africa. It is true that we totally lost the consumers, the people with small, low earning. You know, they don't buy packaging. They won't buy a Nutella jar like that. They will buy some Nutella wrapped around some plastics that someone will sell on the street. So this is why I say that another huge constraint to educate consumers and to fix the bar of consumer responsibility is illiteracy and functional illiteracy. On functional illiteracy, even in countries like in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe, we are losing ground. There are more and more people with functional literacy issues that cannot make an informed decision because they cannot read or can hardly read. And even if they can read, they don't understand what they read.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pierre. I definitely agree that we got ourselves into quite a big of a challenge, and that we need to distinguish between different situations, and those different situations don't have the same solutions. So now, finally, I'm giving the word to Roxbrook for his question.
Okay, thank you very much, Leila. Pierre, first of all, congratulations for what I think is an excellent presentation, right? I have to say that I do agree with your suggestions, with your normative implications. And I have three questions, right, which I'd like you to consider, right? Now, my first question is that, you know, in your discussion, right, especially in the last part of the presentation about the large economic costs associated with the problems of overweight, right? Where do you think are the limits of the voluntary regulation, right? Because in spite of the mouthful of evidence that we have, you know, on the adverse and basically countervailing effects of voluntary regulation, for exemption on the consumption of products that are saturated with trans fats or high loaded with sugars, right? The more and more evidence tells us, right, all these regulations tend to fail, you know, for the reasons of consumer myopia, short-term sightedness, whatever, right? But governments have been increasingly adopting them, right? Because, for example, if I go back to the case of the trans fats regulation, right? For example, in Europe, we can have two, for example, contrasting stories, right? The case of Denmark, which after imposing a direct ban on trans fats, which was basically costless, right? They just banned it, right? It almost eliminated, right, all the instances of coronary heart disease, right, in a matter of 12 years. Germany, by contrast, adopted a radically different approach. So what they did, they opted for the so-called Leitfaden, so basically on the so-called some industry guidelines where industry leaders meet a couple of times a year, and they set the standard for the industry. Now, when we evaluated this, we found that, whoa, this policy is actually causing additional coronary mortality, right? And that might also, so basically, where do you think are the limits of, or the voluntary regulation, of course, against what we're all trying to achieve, so kind of libertarian paternalism to boost sustainability conscious behavior, right? Because, and this relates to my second question, these companies, right, and industries, I think what we are underestimating here is that over time, they are getting increasingly clever at bypassing any type of non-voluntary regulation, right? They spare no effort in applying artificial intelligence methods, right, or even machine learning recently, just for a simple fact of what you've mentioned, to try to hide all the negative externalities away from the eyes of the consumer, right? Then, of course, so again, bypassing this regulation, of course, I see as a major obstacle, right? So basically, we should be talking about how to basically prevent them bypassing the regulation one way or another. For example, what happened in Denmark when the government banned trans fats, the producers of these foods, when they removed the amount of trans fats, they reverted to a different marketing technique. They didn't report the weight of the product on the label because that was not something subject to the law, right? And third of all, I think also, what is your opinion, because on the importance of measuring, right, the effectiveness of this regulation? Because my view is that if we will never be able to measure how effective or even ineffective certain regulation is, we will never be able to understand what we are actually talking about, right? So do you think that there is enough pressure within our sustainability circle that these regulations should be measured, right? Because I think, especially when you mentioned with the case of Nutella, right, it reminds me of the old saying of Lenin, right? Based on his writings of the revolution in 1980, when he wrote that anything that citizens want, right, the Soviet Union should give them the right to the freedom of speech, freedom of independence, right, regular elections, right? But beforehand, the party should make sure that the power is left intact. And these companies are acting in the same way. They will do everything. They will supply QR codes, right? They will supply all the information. They will fake it if necessary, as long as the core industry, and the core goal, and that's basically the relentless pursuit of profit, is left intact. So how do you think we can reconcile and address these potential caveats and limitations? And once again, congratulations for the presentation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, right, thank you. It's answering what you're raising could take 1 hour at least. I don't think that. I think that and I have nothing against Ferrero and Nutella. I'm just taking this as an example of snack, and I think that we will need to consider snack like a little bit the tobacco industry and apply the same pressures on those companies. I think it's the only way that things will change. I don't think that voluntary standards can address the issue, the global health issue that you are raising. I don't think at all that voluntary standards. This is not. Again, as I said, as any standard, and as you say, companies are getting more and more clever. So what is a certification? The certification is that you outsource your sustainability responsibility to third-party organizations.
Exactly.
Or you buy assurance police. But what we have learned in the recent years that as the pressure is increasing on some supply chains like palm oil, like cocoa, like you mentioned, the lithium, the treaty, the gold, that those standards don't protect the brand. So you're paying a very high price to get certified. And when you need your assurance to protect you, they say, no, you're alone. So manage your trouble alone. So what is happening is that many company organizations are now developing their in-house standard. This is the case with Starbucks. This is the case with the Body Shop. This is the case with Sainsbury, the UK retailer. And many others companies are flirting with this idea of replacing third-party voluntary standards by in-house standards and report on their own initiative. If it's a trend, and I think it is a trend, we will need to, tighten the requirements on reporting. And as I said, not the way you report or the processes you have put in place to report, but on the outcomes. What are the real impact you're having? We're talking more and more of carbon sequestrations and carbon taxations. But I think that carbon emission is one impact among the many impacts that our industrial way of living have. So I think it is a narrow view to focus only on carbon and energy. So what I would like to see before I die is an impact exchange, where company will trade impact, positive impact and negative impact, where we will consider everything, not only health issues, living conditions, protections of natural habitats, biodiversity, inequality, because inequalities is the biggest threat to our species. So another thing that we will need to address in the coming years is not the scarcity of some raw materials like lithium, but the disparition of some raw materials, some key raw materials. Yes. I can mention a few: bauxite, lithium, magnesium, natural graphite, natural rubber, phosphorus rock, phosphorus, silicon metal, tantalum. And so we know that those raw materials will totally disappear, or the quantity will be so small that. So what do we do from here to the end of the availability of those raw materials? Will the EU or the world regulate where this material should be used, for which industry, to make sure that we really have the output will be public good rather than product that we don't really need or don't need at all? I know I'm not answering totally your questions, but I think it's in the same spirit. We definitively need more standardizations, harmonizations. We need to, one reason there is no sustainability mandatory information on this is because there is no consensus. There is no, at the international level and at the regional and country level, there is no consensus of what is the criteria and principle and criteria of sustainable development that could be translated into specific indicator, mentions, label, reporting requirement, and impact outcomes. And I think that's the huge challenge that we'll need to address in the coming 20 or 30 years.
So if I can sum up, if I understood correctly, Pierre, it's basically creating this network of standards that is bulletproof in the sense of the standards are the same throughout the industries. They're kind of on the same level right now. There's a level playing field. So the holes, to find your way around them, would be too small. So that was basically the answer to Roque's question, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, yes, it is.
Okay.
It is. And we can see that with the ESG reporting that is so popular now, that they are trying to standardize the approach. But again, the loophole is that they will, because it's mainly accountants that are taking this role now. So we know how accountants work. They will really look at the procedure in place, the policies, and not the source, the credibility of the source of information, and more important, the real impact that the product or the brands or the activities, the processing activities will have on the people and the environment.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Roque, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very
Perfect.
much.
Thank you, everyone. So we came to the conclusion of the first day. If you have any additional questions, comments, suggestions, feel free to contact me on an email or through the webpage of the conference. This concludes our day for today. So I wish to thank every single one of our speakers today for the interesting debate on consumer policy and sustainability, I believe there's much work more to be done. So everyone, have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll be seeing you tomorrow morning once again, 10 a.m. sharp here. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you. Bye.